Welcome. Welcome to this Center for Comparative Public Law seminar. I'm Cora Chan, Associate Professor of Law at Hong Kong U. We're extremely honored today to have with us the legendary Professor Richard Albert, William Stamps Parrish Professor of Law at the University of Texas at Austin. Richard is a real legend, a superstar, an outstanding scholar, and exemplary leader in the academic community. He has been a profound source of inspiration for me and so many others on so many fronts. His scholarship, for instance, has been groundbreaking. They're elegant works, and they're all so thoughtful scholarly works. And those who know Albert would find him to be a source of inspiration through his energy, his passion, generosity, kindness, and righteousness. Richard is definitely one of the kindest and most visionary and righteous persons that I've known. So it's a real honor to be able to introduce Richard here. And as we all know, he's a world-leading authority of constitutional amendments. And I should say congratulations here, because your masterpiece, your monograph on constitutional amendment, entitled Constitutional Amendments, Making, Breaking, and Changing Constitutions, will be published with OUP soon. I believe later this month.
I think first week of August.
First week of August, so we're all anticipating that. Congratulations. Richard is the co-editor of the new series in comparative constitutionalism at OUP. He sits on the editorial board of the International Journal of Constitutional Law, amongst other journals. He's won so many prestigious research, teaching, and leadership awards, and you could all go on his website to see the full list. He has founded many meaningful initiatives for the public law community, including, I must add, some very good initiatives for supporting young scholars. He is the Secretary General of the International Society of Public Law. He holds an elected membership in the International Academy of Comparative Law and has served on the EXCO of the American Society of Comparative Law. And I'm also very proud to be able to introduce Richard as my classmate and friend. We were BCL classmates at Oxford 13 years ago. It's been some time, and so I'm so pleased. You have no idea how many times I've bragged about being your BCL classmate to other people. So I'm really proud to be able to say that I was your classmate and to be introducing you as a classmate and a friend. And on that note, I have to say too that Dante and I, and we have this WhatsApp, the BCL WhatsApp group with the 7 of us from Hong Kong, and we were always wondering how you cannot change a bit at all since we first met you 13 years ago in Oxford. So I don't know how you do it with so prolific, producing so much and serving the community, the public law community and the wider community so generously, and yet not change a bit. So let's welcome Richard Albert. He's going to talk to us on discretionary referendums, so we would have the pleasure of having a glimpse at some of the themes in his forthcoming monograph.
Thank you so much, Cora. I wish my mom had been here to hear that introduction. I think that's the best introduction I've ever gotten, and it makes sense.
Not a problem, it sounds like a eulogy.
There's a blurry distinction, right? The line that
It's good to be able to
separates
get that off like the public display of admiration.
We'll keep it for the record, and hopefully 50 years from now.
But really, thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I look around the room, I see some very familiar faces, I see some friends. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor for me to be at this particular place because I think it's one of the leading universities for the study of public law. I think this faculty in law is really quite outstanding. So those of you who are students here, who are staff here, who are on the faculty here, you're very, very lucky. You know that for sure, but you're very, very lucky to have colleagues like Cora and to be surrounded by such great people. So with that, let me just begin this very short talk, which I hope will be more of a way to seed a conversation that we can have together about how constitutions change. Imagine Cora becomes president somewhere, some country where she can be president, is eligible to be president. And Cora wants to make a change to the Constitution. And so she looks at the text of the Constitution. The text says, well, you need Congress or the Parliament to introduce an amendment proposal that must be approved by a certain number of legislators, let's say 2/3. It must then be ratified in some other way. So imagine it's a federal state, and there are provinces or lender or states, and it must be ratified by a supermajority of those states. Now, Cora wants to make this amendment. I'm not going to tell you what the amendment is. It doesn't matter. The content doesn't matter. All that matters is that Cora, as president, wants to make the amendment. The second thing that matters is that there's obstruction in the Congress. So Cora goes to a sponsor in the Congress and says, I'd like you to introduce this amendment proposal, because Cora can't introduce it on her own under the rules of the Constitution. And the sponsor says, no, I don't like this amendment. I don't like the content, and I just don't want to do it. And Cora exhausts all of her colleagues and allies in the Congress, no one wanting to support this proposal. So what does Cora do? Cora can do a number of things. Cora can give up. Say, well, it's just not in the cards. Cora can continue trying to build a coalition over time. Maybe it will happen. Maybe you get your own allies in through the subsequent congressional elections, and you develop a majority of people who support your idea for an amendment. The third thing Cora could do is what I want to talk about today. Cora can go over the heads of the Congress, over the heads of the states, directly to the people in a referendum. Now, Cora can do that because we've seen this done around the world. There are precedents for this. The question is whether it's appropriate for Cora to do that in her capacity as president of this jurisdiction. So we see in all corners of the world today that leaders, incumbents, are violating the rules of change. This was just one example of that kind of violation of a codified rule of change. The Constitution says this is how you amend. Cora says I don't want to follow that because I don't want to or because I can't, and goes directly to the people. What do we do in that kind of situation? I want to call this a discretionary referendum because it's not mandated by the Constitution. It's by discretion. What do we do? How do we evaluate? How do we assess that kind of a change? Now, one implication of this discretionary referendum is that its use can be either illegal or legally invalid, but may nonetheless be legitimate. So illegal or legally invalid, but nonetheless legitimate. How might that be? I want to talk a bit about that. And a second implication, I think quite obvious, but nonetheless worth mentioning, is the reality that constitutions do not, because of course they cannot, set out in advance all of their rules, not even their rules of change. And the point here is that even a codified constitution is an incomplete code of the rules of change. Here's my plan for the time I have. I want to make 3 points about the use of discretionary referendums. One, I want to explain why it's important that we play by the rules of the game, by which I mean the codified rules or the accepted rules of the game that need not be codified. 2, I want to explain to you very quickly how incumbents around the world have broken the codified rules of change, 4 ways that they've used a discretionary referendum to amend the Constitution. And I'll refer to Canada, to Colombia, to France, and to the UK. And then third, I want to brainstorm with you reasons why incumbents would make the calculated decision to defy these rules of change, to break the rules that the Constitution sets for its own amendment by going over the heads of the amending actors directly to the people. Why would they do that? What are the motivations for doing that? But first, I just want to say thank you again. Really happy to be here. I really, really am. This is my third time in the city, second time at HKU, and I always love coming here, so thank you for being here. First point. Why is it important to play by the rules of the game, the rules of constitutional change? One empirical point first, before I dive into the rules. 96% of all codified constitutions codify rules for changing the text. 96%. It's the most common element across all constitutions that we find. It's not human rights. It's not the existence of a court. It's amendment rules. Part of the reason, I think, is that formal amendment, amending the Constitution pursuant to the codified rules, has important democracy-enhancing virtues. It offers a public, a predictable, a transparent way to express the aggregated preferences of lawmakers and of the people that they represent. Amendment rules, when they're used, they telegraph when and how a constitution changes. And these rules, I think, also produce changes that are legislatively or popularly validated as authoritative. They're authoritative because they have gone through this process. And the very fact of their survival going through this process gives them this kind of legitimacy. These procedures invite civic engagement. Whether or not the amendment is successful, when it's initiated and people start thinking and talking about it, that I think is good for democracy. Performs an educative function as well. We learn about the Constitution when we engage it in its procedures and we think about how and whether we want to change it. I think an important point as well is that the codification of amendment rules makes the rules of change knowable, accessible. The fact that they're codified, these rules, reassures reformers and their opponents and the people of the standard that the Constitution requires to change the rules of law in society. One more point and then I'll skip the rest, is that when a change is successful, ordinarily the formal amendment publicizes the result of that change in the Constitution. It's a collectively created new writing that offers a visible and overt referent for future debate and coordination, also for subsequent efforts to amend the Constitution anew, maybe to undo the newly codified rule of change. I do want to add just one more point before moving along, which is that circumvention of these rules of change, I think, may be politically expedient. So when Cora says, I'm going to go directly to the people, she's doing that for a reason, because she risks failure going through the Congress. So there's a political expediency here involved in circumventing the codified rules of change. But in the end, my point is, the larger point, one takeaway, is that that degrades the Constitution and it undermines the rule of law. Maybe it's an obvious point, but I think it's important in the face of what we see around the world these days of violations of codified rules of change. It degrades the Constitution by signaling that the constitutional text does not in fact bind in all cases, and that its authority is contingent on the variable preferences of actors, of incumbents. And also think that when we circumvent the codified rules of change, that undermines our expectations for the rule of law. Expectations that we all know, most of us know, have been theorized by Lon Fuller. So first, Fuller says, when you repeatedly circumvent the rules of change, and we give the impression that it's proper to create law on an ad hoc basis, that undermines the rule of law. It undermines the assurance that we have about how law is going to be enforced, how law is going to be done. It also entails a failure to publicize how we make law. Finally, it rejects what I think is a necessary feature of law, which is a congruence between the rules as announced and how those rules are administered. So that's the first volley that I want to take you through, why it's important to follow the rules of change. In the end, I'll have a point that is an exception to this, to say sometimes it's okay to violate the rules of change. So how have incumbents broken the rules of change. I want to go through very quickly 4 cases. These are representative of different ways incumbents have violated the rules of change by going directly to the people. So first, France. In 1962, de Gaulle went directly to the people over the heads of the parliament. Why? Because he wanted a directly elected presidency. Prior to that, the president of France was elected through an electoral college, not unlike the US electoral college. The difference is that in the US, there are 535 electors, and then at the time, in 1962, there were 80,000 electors in France. De Gaulle said, I want a directly elected president. The parliament said no. You can imagine why. Why would we give the president a mandate directly from the people? We are the ones who represent the people, the parliament thought. So the parliament said, no, we're not going to propose the amendment. It had to go through the parliament. And so de Gaulle went directly to the people, and he won. He won his referendum. And what's interesting is that someone challenged the validity of that amendment, went to court, to the Conseil Constitutionnel, and the court said, we have no jurisdiction to review what the people have said. Interesting. Very, very interesting. So, second example is a more recent example. It's Brexit. There is no requirement, as you know, for the incumbent party to go to the people for any change that he or she, as the Prime Minister, wants to make. Yet that's what David Cameron did. David Cameron, in the party's manifesto, said, we will go to the people and hold a referendum on withdrawing from the EU. He didn't have to do that. He could have gone directly to Parliament with his majority and passed that bill into law. But he went to the people. And then, of course, as you know, Brexit was successful. Someone sued, went to the court. And the question there was whether the UK could give notice of its intention to withdraw from the EU on the strength of a governmental declaration alone, or whether parliamentary authorization was needed. The court said, you need parliament. 2 more examples, and then I'll come back to these and categorize them in some way. In Canada, where I'm from, in 1992, there was a major effort to amend the Constitution. It's called the Charlottetown Accord, an effort to bring peace to the many peoples of Canada in the aftermath of our patriation of the Constitution in 1982. Political actors chose to go directly to the people in a referendum. They didn't have to, because there's no mechanism in the Constitution for direct popular consent. Yet they chose to do that. Why? Because 5 years prior, in a similarly large effort to amend the Constitution, they had done everything in closed doors, right? In back rooms, with no popular consultation, no popular input. And so to right that wrong, it was considered a wrong. They overcorrected. And they said, now, in this second effort, we're going to go directly to the people and ask them what they think. That referendum failed. And the fourth and final one I want to raise for you, put on the table for a discussion, was from Colombia. Colombia, in 2016, reaches a peace deal between the government and the FARC. And the deal was proposed as an amendment to the Constitution. Yet before proposing the amendment, the president wanted to see what the people thought of the deal. So he organized a plebiscite, not a referendum, a plebiscite, which is an up or down vote on the peace deal. Now, the key part about the plebiscite under the Colombian Constitution is that it's binding on the president. It's binding on the president. So what the people say on the plebiscite must be followed by the president in his future or her future conduct. The plebiscite fails by a quite narrow margin, 50.2 to 49.8. The president is asked, are you going to hold a second plebiscite when you, no doubt, redo the deal and go back again to see if you can make it as an amendment? And he says, no, I'm not going to go back to the people. They have said no. He goes back, he works with the Congress, works with the FARC. They agree on a second deal, which is not quite different at all, substantially, from the first deal. This time, he does not go to the people. Congress takes the lead, and the amendment is adopted, changes the Constitution. The FARC deal is official. These 4 changes to the Constitution by referendum have 4 different kinds of effects, and I want to use these as a way of categorizing these 4 uses of referendums into a typology. So in France, the referendum, as you recall, was successful. The court said, we have no authority to gainsay what the people have said. So I want to suggest that this referendum reconstructed the rules of change. It added a new way, uncodified way, of amending the Constitution simply by recourse to the referendum. It is now possible today to go to the people directly to amend the Constitution by presidential decree, even though it's not stated as such in the constitutional text. So it's a reconstructive kind of referendum. The UK is different, because in the UK, the successful Brexit referendum did not exert the same kind of transformative legal effect that we saw in France. What happened here was that the referendum was in fact revertative. It pressed political actors to return to the conventional way of changing the Constitution, which is by Parliament. So in this case, what you see is that the referendum was legally ineffective, had no legal effect. Of course, it was politically quite powerful, but legally, the use of the referendum was ineffective. It's as though it had never happened. In Canada, the failure of the referendum in the Charlottetown Accord to put an end to the amendment process shows that, not the failure to put an end, the fact that the use of the referendum put an end to the amendment process shows that that amendment was obstructive. It stood in the way of further progress on amending the Constitution of Canada. It really stopped all potential amendment efforts in 1992, even though that referendum was advisory, had no legal effect. It had a political effect, but that political effect was so strong that it put an end to all the efforts to amend the Constitution that year, and since, in fact. There have been no major amendments to the Constitution of Canada since then. And in Colombia, I want to say that this last amendment was inoperative. The referendum was inoperative. Why? Leaders ignored the result of the referendum, the plebiscite technically, despite the president's earlier commitment that he would respect the voice of the people. So the referendum had no effect. It was treated as invalid in politics, whereas in Canada, the referendum was treated invalid in law. I've gone through these cases very quickly. I'm happy to talk more about these in detail. There's also a paper, if you'd like to read, that goes through these cases in greater detail. But first, I want to just close with some brainstorming with you about why an incumbent would use a discretionary referendum to make an amendment to the Constitution. Several reasons. I want to maybe go through a few, not all of them. A few I'm happy to talk about these. And then we'll have a lot of time for discussion and debate, which I'm looking forward to. One reason, I think, why an incumbent might use a discretionary referendum is the intrinsic appeal. The intrinsic appeal may be an unassailable appeal of going to the people, because it clothes the decision of a political actor in the legitimacy of political will, of popular will. When you say that the people support this, it's hard to gainsay that if you're in the opposition. You can, of course, debate it as a matter of human rights and say, well, the people should not have a say on human rights matters. As an example, there are some constitutions that deny the people the power to have any role on amendment when it comes to human rights. But you might say that intrinsically it's an unassailable appeal that what the people say goes. So it makes sense then for an incumbent to go directly to the people to do something that he or she would like to see in the Constitution. Instrumentally is maybe a second reason. Instrumentally, there is a value to gathering popular approval for major constitutional change. It's different from the intrinsic point. Instrumentally, it's important because it's then hard to say, as an opposition member, that amendment should not be passed on the strength of this referendum that was successful. Third, and this I think, now we can come back to Cora as our president. The third reason is maybe it's just too difficult to amend the Constitution, according to the codified rules of change. 2/3 agreement in the parliament, supermajority of states or provinces, it's just too difficult. And when there's an amendment that we think is necessary to make, but for which the political will is simply not there, maybe it's justified to go over the heads of the Congress, of the states, directed the people to do what we think is necessary. I'll maybe name 2 more things, and then we can talk about these other ones if you like. It may be true, may be possible, that if you go to the people to make a change to the Constitution in conflict with the codified rules of change, that the fact that you go directly to the people entrenches the change more durably than would be the case were you to follow simply the codified rules of change, right? Because it's supported by, bolstered by political will, popular will, it may just make the change more durable. And then finally, it may be that the incumbents want to push the polity toward a more popular consent-based type of regime. Perhaps they'll move from elite to popular, perhaps a move from hereditary to popular. That may be something that the political actors try to do. I want to close now with a jurisdiction that I've traveled from. I'm Canadian, but I live and I work in the United States. The United States is a jurisdiction where rule violation is normal, maybe more so today than ever before. But rule violation is not out of the ordinary historically. The origins of the U.S. Constitution are in fact rooted in rule violation, in rule breaking. The Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution, said you needed unanimous agreement among 13 states to change the Constitution. That was not followed. The Articles of Confederation were replaced by the U.S. Constitution. Then the Reconstruction Amendments are also irregular in the way they were ratified. Another instance of rule breaking. So in the U.S. there's a I don't want to say there's a culture of rule breaking, but there's a practice of rule breaking. And this leads me to the exception that I want to raise to the point that I made at the beginning, which is that we should always follow the rules. The exception, which is quite interesting, I think, from my perspective, it is, you tell me. There's a very important paper that will soon be a book, written by my co-editor at iConnect. His name is David Landau. The paper is called Abusive Constitutionalism. The theory, in short, powerful theory, in short, the theory is that around the world, he lists Venezuela, Hungary, and he also talks about Poland, among others, Turkey as well. The theory is that what we see happening around the world is a strict adherence to the codified rules of change, but also the codified rules in the Constitution, a strict legalistic adherence to these rules in furtherance of non-democratic objectives, which is a puzzle, because one would think that when we follow the Constitution, the outcome is going to be constitutional, but the theory is that the outcome is unconstitutional in the sense that it's undemocratic. Right? So you have strict rule following with outcomes that we don't like. What I'm describing to you today is the opposite. We have, or at least possibly the opposite. We have rule breaking, where sometimes the outcome is precisely what we want. Rule breaking to advance human rights, for example. Rule breaking to balance separated powers, for example. Rule breaking to achieve democratic objectives. So the exception that I want to just flag for us to think about is, are we okay with Quora breaking the codified rules of change to pass an amendment that we think is valid? Valid from a higher law perspective, valid from a human rights perspective, valid because we think it's a good amendment. Or must it always be the case that we follow the rules of change? This, I think, is a question. It is becoming a more important question as we see around the world leaders, incumbents, violating the codified rules of change to pass amendments that from their perspective are good, but that may not be good from some objective truth. And the problem, the challenge is, how do you support Cora's amendment, the content of which we think is great, while at the same time rejecting, resisting, opposing the amendment passed by an incumbent who goes directly to the people to make a change that we think is contrary to human rights or contrary to some objective good? Is there a principled basis for us to reject both? Excuse me, reject one but not the other? One answer is to say, well, we have to reject both. If you're going to follow the rules, whether it's to achieve some positive good or whether it's to achieve something else. Just follow the rules. Another answer is to say, well, no, we're adults. We know what is good, what is bad. We can distinguish a good amendment, Cora's amendment, from a bad amendment. I think it's more complicated than that. I think it's important to have a culture of rule following. And I think the only exception where rule following can be set aside, where rules can be broken when we go directly to the people, is when we go directly to the people. Because that, I think, is the higher law. It's a law that sits above all other laws, popularly supported changes to the Constitution. Unfortunately, I have to say, whatever the content. Whatever the content. When it's supported, yeah, I know you disagree.
You cannot say that.
I know, I see you nodding. I see you disagreeing, but this is the ultimate rule of law. We can debate it. But the ultimate rule of law in a modern democracy is that what the people say must go. Must go. And with that, I'm looking forward to your points and your debates.
I just want to ask a question whenever you give me permission.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Can I ask you?
Yeah, well, I've plenty of questions and comments myself, but I think I should open it
I
up.
just wanted to ask a question I think is really interesting because you're engaging in something that is quite difficult. And what do we do when we go to the people and the people say we should have a dictatorship?
Mm-hmm.
No rights, etc., social, political, civil. What do we do?
Yeah.
Because you know that in the case of UK and others, far-right, violent, political, all the story are associated with the referendum and created a whole different political and legal landscape with challenges. So what do we do if the people decide that?
I'm glad you asked the question. That's the key question. But it's even worse than this, possibly. It's even worse than the people voting to give themselves a dictatorship. Imagine people vote to say, we're going to execute this person's, this category of people.
Third, Philippines, you have that.
Great.
Sorry.
Precisely. So I'm glad you asked the question, because I think I was provocative on purpose, because I wanted to get to this point, which is what I'm getting to now, which is that there must be conditions for referendal votes. There must be conditions on what makes a valid, legitimate referendum vote. So one, it's important that the voters be informed, and that entails a number of designs in the vote itself. That entails proper funding and financing, not just for both, but for all sides on the issue. So that means that political parties would get financing, that means that interest groups would get financing, that means that not anyone, but valid groups would get financing to let their ideas be known and shared with the electorate. And this is not unusual. We see around the world, in some countries, we see what has been called a fourth branch, an independent electoral body, for example, that is independent, that is insulated from politics, that governs elections, but also referendums. We also see examples of constitutions that codify in their text rules for equal access to the press, precisely so that people can be equally informed about the stakes involved in whether you vote A, B, or C, or D, or F. So that's one part, I think, of the question is, how are we designing the referendum question? That will not, on its own, avoid the rise of an elected dictatorship. but it can help to create an informed vote. One of the problems with Brexit was that it wasn't informed, so they say. Another part of the design question is that it's a question for me whether one vote on one day is sufficient. That does not test the durability of what the people want. If you really want to know what the people want, you test the vote, right? You test the outcome. So you vote on day one, and then maybe there's a cooling off period and you have a confirmatory vote at some point down the road. I wrote a paper about this a few years ago suggesting that that would be a way of making significant, substantial, transformative changes to the Constitution. If you go to the people, have a cooling off period so that you can test the durability of the people's will. So I'm glad you asked the question because it allows us to ask how precisely can we determine when the people say precisely what it is that they want, right? So I don't think that it's a good idea, of course, to have an elected dictatorship. And there are ways of designing votes, institutions that allow votes, not to deny that to the people, but to make sure that they know what they're getting into.
Yes, we have another question.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm curious, maybe we can also investigate more a little bit when we talk about the people. And just to stress, for example, you at the beginning, if we go through the parliament, the rule for the amendment is a supermajority. But when you go to a referendum, it tends to be a simple majority. And I find that this is kind of speaks a lot to legitimacy. If we have 51% of the country voting for Brexit, for example, and 49 against, when the margin is so little, to what extent we can even use the term people. So yeah, I mean, it just kind of just throwing some thoughts. So it seemed to me, if we talk about people, it would be fair to say 75% or a supermajority, something that resembles more the constitutional procedure.
I don't disagree with that. That's another way of making sure that the vote is informed, that the vote is durable. The vote is also representative, right? It reflects what the people in this jurisdiction really want. A 51% vote is not that. I'm from a country where in 1995 there was a vote very closely divided about whether one part of the country was going to secede. Right? This is Quebec. It was very close. So I don't think that votes of that magnitude, of that scale, should be treated as valid when it's a 51% outcome. Not only that, I think yes, should be supermajority, but I also think that there should be attention given to different geographical regions of the country. So, for example, some constitutions will say in federal states, if you want to amend the Constitution in a way that affects the powers, prerogatives, rights of this particular province or state or lander, that state has to approve the change. So that you can't have the other states and the peoples in the other states or provinces or lander ganging up and taking away rights from the states. So, to apply to our conversation, if there's a referendum that affects a particular people within a larger community of peoples, or if there's a referendum that affects a particular region, I think it's an important question to ask, and I'd be interested in having this conversation, and I would recommend this as a design to require the consent of those peoples who are affected by the change. Otherwise, you have the tyranny of the majority. Of course, the counter-argument is that they can exert the tyranny of the minority, right? But in a modern constitutional democracy, we have these institutions precisely to protect minorities. That's the function of a Bill of Rights. That's the function of judicial review, right? If the majority can trample over minorities, that's not a modern constitutional democracy. So it's important to have protections for those peoples, whatever the lines of differences between them and the others may be.
Right, thanks, Richard. Very interesting.
Fellow Canadian.
Yeah. I wonder if you could say a little bit about your claim of rule breaking and how there's a violation of the rule of law. I'm thinking about your 4 examples. I can see it for France. Not so clear for Brexit and for Canada. Because I think with Charlottetown, even if the referendum did pass, you still had to apply the constitutional formulation for amending the Constitution, right?
That's right.
So I don't quite see the rule breaking there. And also with Brexit, I'm not quite sure what rules is violated.
Yeah, if I may just follow up on that, because I had exactly the same query. When you're saying that the only exception to rule breaking is, and then you have a list of conditions, including that the referendum is to advance principles of constitutionalism. Do you have what exactly do you have in mind by exception? Are you saying that the only circumstance in which the referendum should bind legally, or are you saying also that the only circumstances in which the referendum would be viewed as politically or morally legitimate? It's essentially, I think, the same question. Yeah.
You both have put your finger, and I guess you also want to ask this question too, Son, I think, right? And Rhea? You put your finger on an important point, which is, are these all examples of rule breaking?
Yeah.
And I think you're quite right that the French example is the clearest example of rule breaking. In Brexit in Canada, you're right. But here's why I think it's closer to rule breaking than rule following. I will concede that it's not fully rule breaking, but it's custom breaking and custom changing. And the distinction between rule and custom it's a blurry distinction. So in the UK, for example, the practice has never been to go to the people.
Oh, that's not right. There have been many referenda now.
There have been referenda, but it's never had legal effect. That's the
It
point.
didn't have legal effect. Parliament then had to legislate.
Yes, I know this. There's a beautiful paper by Rivka Weil that goes through this. Now, the point I want to make is that when you have this rule violation, I'm not going to say rule violation, what is possible is that this will create a new rule. And that's simply how conventions are created, how conventions are changed. And I fear that this could become a convention in the UK and in Canada. So in Canada, we have this example of rule violation in the Charlottetown Accord. And today, in the face of proposals to make major amendments to the Constitution of Canada, observers, scholars are saying, we have to go to the people like we did in Charlottetown. Why? There's nothing in the codified Constitution that requires that. The reason why is because of this Charlottetown precedent. Because it happened once, people are saying now, well, you have to go to the people again if you propose to make a major change to the Constitution of Canada. And I suspect, although I don't know for sure, that we'll have this conversation for a future major change in the UK because of this precedent. That is a concern. That is a concern for me. When we change the Constitution, it must be done in a constitutional way. Now, the UK situation is different from these other three because it has an uncodified Constitution. It has a disaggregated, uncodified Constitution where there is no big bang moment of Constitution making or Constitution changing. It happens over time by evolution, by practice, although there's a recent paper by Adam Tompkins and Adam Perry who suggests that we can have the creation of conventions by top-down, right? Where the incumbents create a convention simply by their practice and say that this is now a convention. So in Canada, Simon, I think the practice of using a referendum to change the Constitution, it risks now becoming a convention, a Constitution-level rule. Why is that a problem? Because Part 5 of the Canadian Constitution's Constitution Act 1982 says that if you want to change the Constitution's rules of change, you must amend the Constitution. This will be a change by practice. And so for me, that's why this rule violation is closer to rule breaking than it is to anything else. But you're quite right that it's not like the French case. I think Simon wanted to follow up.
Yeah.
It's just two short replies. I mean, the referendum, isn't it just a way of consulting the people, right? And if you're changing something so important as the Constitution, you know, what's wrong with consulting the people, right? The second reply is, I mean, in Canada, we've seen other conventions that have developed, but they don't stay. I mean, there's conventions that they have adopted for appointing Supreme Court justices. Right? I think they flirted with different conventions, right? But they don't necessarily, you're not bound by it. That's the whole idea. It's a convention. Right? So I'm not sure why you feel you're so afraid of trying new things, to consult and why you feel somehow that I mean, I think it is an important distinction, custom and law, because it's not a law. You're not violating law. So hence the effects on rule of law, I think, are less.
And also, I think the legal certainty and predictability that we valued about the rule of law would also be developed over time if it becomes a convention that we consult before changing the Constitution. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to take a couple more questions before handing it back to you.
Just 10 seconds before Simon goes, which is the problem I see with inserting this referendum in the Canadian process or any other process where there's a codified rule but we go to the people, is that then denies agency to the legislators or whoever is tasked with the responsibility to make the choice about whether or not to amend the Constitution. So in the Charlottetown Accord, had the vote been positive, then the provincial legislatures and territorial legislatures would have had no choice but to vote the same way. Politically, they would have had no choice, right? No agency. So that's the problem, is that the Constitution doesn't give the choice to the people, it gives it to the legislators. And if we want to give the choice to the people, then let's do that when we design the Constitution. But you're quite right. Very good. Thank you for coming.
Do you mind if I just ask a clarification on the rule breaking in the US? You said that it's practiced by who? Which institution? Is it the president, or you said?
Yeah.
Is it by the president?
It has been by the executive, by the legislative branches. In the case of the Articles, it was a specially constituted body, a constitutional convention, the Philadelphia Convention, that broke the rules of change in the Articles of Confederation. And then the rules were then broken by the specific state-level constitutional conventions that were convened to ratify the rule-breaking choices of the Philadelphia Convention.
Son and then James.
Thank you, Richard, for a very provocative presentation. And two things. One is my observation about this is very provocative for the general scholarship, but it's not very new to your old scholarship, because I can consider the consistency between this paper and your Cornell paper on the unconstitutional constitution and the democratic foundations. Yes. In both papers, you all talk about breaking the rules, but it is necessary breaking the rule, right? But in the Cornell paper, you talk about the democratic foundations in the US, Canada, South Africa,
And Mexico.
And Mexico. And there is a new development in this paper. You talk more about the more general public well-being of the necessity of breaking the rule. So, but this is very consistent in your scholarship. That there is a new development in this paper. This is my observation, and my question is: the papers seems to be evaluative, or rather than explanatory. I just want to ask whether you can expand the scope of the paper to ask more explanatory questions. For example, under what conditions, political and institutional conditions, CORA really want to have the incentive to use this kind of referendum. It's quite different between a democracy and an authoritarian regimes. If you don't have a strong support from the people, you don't have the incentive to use this kind of referendum. Or if you cannot control popular media, you don't have the incentive, you may fail. So maybe the explanatory question is, under what condition this kind of referendum is successful? And under what condition political leaders really want to introduce this kind of referendum? So I just want to ask whether you can have some comments on this question.
James?
Sure. I'd just like to note my wife's Canadian, so go Canada.
Oh, great.
Right? I want to be part of the group.
Join the club.
Yeah. All right. So, as you're talking, I'm not super familiar with the literature, so excuse me if it's just shows my ignorance, my questions, but it feels like these debates have been going on for forever, and just repackaging. You mentioned your co-author that has a radical idea, and you have a response to it, but it just feels like the thick versus thin theory of rule of law versus rule by law, which has been going on for a really long time. And then also the point about when to have referenda, and with the assumptions of people are informed. These debates went on, if you read Federalist papers, number 51, where there was recognition that the people wouldn't be informed, this sort of tyranny of majority, and James Madison said, look, let's have filters of virtue, let's have representative democracy where there's a smaller group of people that need to be informed and can make better decisions. So I guess I'm just saying, I'm having difficulty reconciling what you're saying with what it feels like were debates that happened like centuries ago. And maybe you could put a fine point on exactly what you're adding to it, or how you're repackaging it, because it feels just like the same thing that was debated back then.
Any more questions?
I have a little comment. I have to admit that I'm also not very familiar with constitutional law concepts, and it seems to me that there are so many factors at play. It depends on whether it's a federal, state, whether the threshold is the same when we're talking about referendum or going via constitutional amendments and all that. And it seems to me that it's not very easy to. It's like when you gave the 4 examples, they're not apples for apples, because they have very different political systems. But coming from a commercial litigation lawyer's kind of perspective, I think I can accept referendum as a basis of circumventing constitutional amendment if the president has a power of dismissing the parliament, and by way of election, that would, achieve the same result. So, for example, in the Hong Kong context, when we have, just one legislative council, assuming that it's democratic, of course we know that it's not right now, but assuming that it's fully democratic, when, Cora, being the chief executive of Hong Kong, wants to propose something, assuming that we also have the referendum system, then, I think it would be expedient to go via the referendum system, because otherwise Cora could well say, well, legislators, you're not cooperating with me, I'm dismissing the legislative council, and have everyone re-electing the representatives into the legislative council, and then pass the bill. It's the same. But of course, when it comes to federalism, it's a little bit different, because even if you dismiss the Congress, have all the representatives re-elected into the Congress, you may still not achieve the same result. So it depends on the structure of the constitutional amendment, whether it necessary. I don't necessarily see that referendum would have a higher moral rights or higher political rights or legal rights over the constitutional amendment mechanism that is in the Constitution, because I see that Constitution, it's a social contract that is already set, and it has its own terms, and it balances, whether you like it or not is another question, but it balances the different interests. Like, well, I don't know much about the US, but I assume that not only that you have to pass through the Congress, but also the Senate, right? In order to have the constitutional amendment. And in terms of the Senate, each state would have like 2 representatives, and that carries a different weight than, you know, one person, one vote in the referendum system. So I don't think it's easy to say that by use of referendum you can amend the constitution in that regard.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take one final question and then I'll give the rest of the airtime. Yes.
I would like to add a very short point. It seems that discretionary referendums would only happen if the constitutional amendment mechanism provided in the Constitution is not one of referendum. If a Constitution provides that the amendment mechanism includes or depends on referendum, then would it provide incentive for those in power, the executive legislature, to circumvent the rule, to circumvent the referendum requirement, because it makes it more difficult to do something else to change the Constitution? That is my question, because the same logic applies essentially. If it is difficult to pass, to go through the codified rules, then you find some other ways.
Yes.
So this is just a point of observation.
Yeah, so this is an interesting puzzle, which is you have a codified constitutional amendment rule that says you must amend by referendum, but the incumbent thinks that he or she will lose in a referendum, so instead says we're going to do it through the Parliament or the Congress. Is that right? This is the question?
Or in any other way.
Some other way.
A Supreme Court enactment and so on.
Yes, yes, yes. Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but I will. Thank you for all of these observations and questions. I think you're quite right that the contexts matter. These are different jurisdictions that have different political institutions where strength is situated one place and it is not in another. But I think that is maybe a strength of the examples that I've used, which is to show that this happens in all kinds of different places around the world. And these are just 4 of other examples. I chose these 4 because I thought they were particularly illustrative. In fact, I'm thinking now of replacing one with Taiwan, with the marriage equality referendum that happened, although that wasn't a constitutional amendment, but it had constitutional level effect, I want to argue. But nonetheless, I think that's part of the interesting thing about these cases is that it's happening all around the world. So there's something about appeals to the people, which is not new. I get that. But what we're seeing today, maybe we've seen it all the time, I don't know, you tell me. But there is a misuse of appeals to the people. Historically, sure, it's happened before, but there's a convergence.
Not like now. Yeah, it's
Not like
different
that.
now. Yeah.
I'm not a historian, but there seems to be today, at this particular moment in time, a convergence between the codification of constitutions and how that is becomes synonymous with democracy, with liberal democracy more specifically. Convergence between that and, on the one hand, David's paper about rule following, legalistic rule following to achieve non-democratic ends. And on the other hand, this is just one manifestation of rule breaking for some positive end. Happens in other ways that are not referendal. But there's this convergence now between codification as democracy and what political actors do in the face of this now global norm of codification. I'm not saying, I don't want to suggest that that's new, that I'm observing something new. But I think I'm illustrating it in a new way. which is interesting by drawing from these cases. I'm a comparative scholar. I draw from different places to try to find commonalities or explain why things are happening in one way or another. And so that's what I'm trying to do here, which is not to suggest that it's pointing to a new phenomenon. In fact, what I'm suggesting, if anything, is a new way that an old phenomenon is being manifest in what we're seeing around the world. Son, you are absolutely right that it's important to ask the question, under what conditions is this possible or not? And I haven't made the distinction as I perhaps should and maybe will in the revision to this draft, because it's just a draft, about different kinds of constitutionalism, right? There's now a discussion about forms of constitutionalism, right? Liberal democratic constitutionalism, authoritarian constitutionalism. You have a book coming out on socialist constitutionalism. It may be, in fact, I think it is worthwhile to think about how that question is answered differently in these different jurisdictions. My limitation, of course, is that I don't know about all of these forms of constitutionalism, how they operate, as well as I know how they operate in my own jurisdictions. But this is why people co-author, right? This is why people learn from each other in this paired or trio kind of a way. So I appreciate that. What I take to be a friendly suggestion, a friendly amendment. And then finally, about circumventing a rule of change that codifies the requirement of a referendum. I guess my answer would be, and I'd have to sit and think more about this, but I guess my answer would be that if we think of forms of constitutional change situated along a hierarchy of legitimacy, by which I mean not moral legitimacy, nor do I mean legal legitimacy, because something can be legitimate as law, but that law can say you kill everyone that wears glasses. Sociological legitimacy is what I mean. If you situate forms of change along this hierarchy of sociological legitimacy, nothing would be higher than a well-informed vote in a referendum. Nothing. Some constitutions require unanimous agreement among representatives of the people, but that can't approximate, that can't exceed the legitimacy, sociological legitimacy that you get from an informed vote of the people that is proven to be durable. So I would say that this example that you've raised, this hypothetical you've raised, is, I wouldn't say it's illegitimate, but it's certainly less legitimate sociologically than what I'm suggesting is a legitimate way of rule breaking to happen, where the vote is informed, where the vote is taken to be durable, where the design is such that we can be comfortable and confident that the outcome of the referendum is one that really reflects the considered judgment of the people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm just going to end with just very two quick points in response to what you just said just now. So if you were to, if we started from the premise that we wanted to advance values of liberal constitutionalism, I think at least one situation which would, and this is not incompatible with anything that you've said, it's probably part of what you already have in mind already, I think is when the original amendment channel is for some reason, there are good reasons to believe that the original amendment channel is unable to reflect a durable popular view, then that would be the occasion when it would be justified to resort to. And of course, the assumption that we advance values, the amendments should advance liberal constitutionalist values, is itself a contestable assumption that has to be justified.
This is not what I'm saying, by the way.
Oh, this is not, yeah.
No. I'm not saying that the amendment itself must have a certain content that is consonant with whatever we define as liberal democracy.
That's not your view.
No, I instead have the view that we can do as much as we can to protect the process by giving people what they need to make an informed vote, by ensuring that the vote is durable by having separated votes, a confirmatory vote. But I don't want to rig the rules of the game by saying that the content must reflect X or Y or Z.
I see.
I am open to whatever the content is. This is a content neutral.
I see. So as long as it's a durable view of the public.
As long as it's representative, that we think it's durable and that it's informed. I think it's hard to reject that kind of change.
I see.
Even if it is, people who wear glasses can't vote.
I see. Okay.
But presumably it wouldn't come to that if it's an informed vote and it's representative and it's inclusive. But we can't, there's no basis to deny that from my perspective. Deny the people that vote that choice.
I see. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. The other, I'm not sure if I share your worries about the harm to the rule of law by resorting to referendums when there is an amendment procedure, because presumably in those jurisdictions where discretionary referendums are held, the government has the legal power to hold a discretionary referendum. As in, it's not something that is illegal. We expect them to have this power. And there are jurisdictions in which holding a referendum would be illegal, and I'm thinking about Hong Kong. So China's made it very clear the Hong Kong government has no power to hold a referendum in Hong Kong. But
we can add to the list Honduras. We can add,
Honduras, yeah. So but in the jurisdictions that you discussed, the government is legally conducting the referendum. There is a legal power, and so we do expect the power to be used. And so in that sense, does that mitigate the concerns about lack of predictability and legal certainty? And this really goes back to Simon's point. I think the referendum, if it's consultative, you could just treat it as a large-scale consultation of the people. And so I don't see how that would seriously compromise the rule.
The people have to be informed, though. Because what
Yes.
you have, when the people is not informed, does not have a sense of history, then you have a big problem. And you have in Europe the far-right movements that have used the referendum for different purposes, so it's absolutely right that those conditions for a referendum are needed. And also on the issue of the rule, breaking the rule of law, which I'm not a lawyer, but I imagine that is an expression used amongst the legal community. But if your presentation was being broadcast outside, you know what's happening in Hong Kong now. What do the people make of the word rule of law? And so the people have to have a sense of history and be informed, I think, and the conditions, I think, are absolutely essential, yeah.
Thank you so much, Cora. Just 10 seconds to say that the reason why I think having this discretionary referendum, even if it's legal, so in Canada what they did was they passed a law to say it's legal to hold a referendum. That's fine. But even if it's legal, the problem I have is that the choice was made at the drafting and the ratification of the Constitution not to give that power to this particular group, and instead to give the power to change the Constitution to that group. And there's such a high political salience given to the choice made by the people that overwhelms the power to choose that these people have. So these people really have no choice in the end because they do whatever the people said. That's the narrow point, which I think I care about, because it's important that we respect the rules of the Constitution as they're codified, as they're ratified. Unless there are some reasons not to do that, and there may be reasons, good reasons, not to follow those rules. But I think those are just exceptional circumstances. But these have been all useful suggestions as I revise this draft, which is an early draft. So I'm really grateful to you all and to you, Cora, for pushing me on these 2 points.
Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking Richard Albert again for discussing.
Thank you.
It'll be great as usual. And thank you all for your wonderful questions. That was
Very good.
Thank you to all. Thank you very
Really,
much.
really helped us think. Thank you.
This is great. I'm just revising it now. It's perfect.
Number